the hardest truths rarely knock twice. Sometimes they simply open the door when you least expect them. Rain drifted quietly across the streets of Seattle as Ethan Carter parked his aging pickup truck beside a small blue house that looked almost forgotten by the busy world surrounding it. The windshield wipers slowed to a stop, leaving tiny drops clinging to the glass while he reached into the passenger seat for 2 grocery bags filled with fresh vegetables, milk, bread, soup, and the cinnamon tea Margaret Wilson always smiled about, but never remembered to buy herself. Before stepping outside, Ethan glanced at the folded drawing resting on the dashboard. His 10-year-old daughter, Lily, had colored a picture of their little family the night before, writing beneath it in careful handwriting. Kind people always find their way home. Ethan smiled softly before placing the drawing back into the glove compartment. He picked up the groceries, adjusted the hood of his rain jacket, and walked carefully along the wet stone pathway leading toward the front porch. The familiar flower pots beside the steps looked healthier than they had a month earlier because he had quietly replanted them after noticing they had nearly died during the summer heat. The porch light was already on even though the afternoon sky had not yet turned dark. Ethan gently placed 1 grocery bag on the wooden bench before knocking 3 light times, exactly the way Margaret preferred because loud knocks startled her. Usually the cheerful elderly woman answered within seconds, greeting him with stories about birds, old recipes, or memories from decades earlier. Today the house remained completely silent. Ethan waited patiently before knocking again. He looked toward the living room window and noticed a suitcase resting beside the couch. That was unusual. Margaret had not traveled anywhere in years. Just as he reached for the groceries again, the lock quietly clicked. The front door slowly opened. Ethan expected to see the warm smile of the elderly neighbor he had visited almost every afternoon for months. Instead, a woman wearing an elegant cream-colored sweater stood frozen in the doorway. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back, but the confidence usually reflected in her posture seemed to disappear within a single heartbeat. Her eyes widened with unmistakable disbelief. Ethan felt the groceries grow heavier in his hands as recognition struck him just as suddenly. Victoria Bennett, the female CEO who had fired him nearly a year earlier without ever asking a single question about the quiet man sitting across from her conference table. Neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the porch roof while distant traffic blended with the steady rhythm of falling water. Ethan searched her face, wondering if time had somehow played a strange trick on both of them. Victoria searched his, struggling to understand why the former employee she had dismissed now stood outside her mother's home carrying groceries as though he belonged there. Finally, she found enough words to break the silence. "Ethan," she asked quietly, almost unsure whether she believed what she was seeing. Ethan nodded once. "Good afternoon." His voice remained calm, carrying neither resentment nor surprise. He lifted one of the grocery bags slightly. "I brought Margaret's groceries. She mentioned yesterday that she was almost out of soup and tea." Victoria looked down at the bags before slowly looking back into his eyes. Confusion replaced certainty. "You know my mother?" Ethan answered with the same quiet sincerity that had guided every conversation throughout his life. "She has been my neighbor for several months." Another long silence followed. Somewhere inside the house, an old grandfather clock echoed through the hallway. Victoria stepped aside without thinking. "Please, come in." Ethan hesitated only briefly before walking through the doorway. Neither of them realized that this simple entrance would quietly begin changing far more than either career or reputation. It would reveal the kind of character that could never appear on a resume, never fit inside a performance review, and never be measured by any title hanging on an office door. Victoria quietly closed the front door behind Ethan, yet neither of them seemed ready to speak again. The familiar scent of cinnamon tea drifted through the warm house, while rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Margaret Wilson looked up from her favorite armchair with a gentle smile that immediately brightened the room. "There you are," she said warmly. "I was beginning to think the rain convinced you to stay home." Ethan placed the grocery bags carefully on the kitchen counter before walking over to her. "You know I would never let a little rain stop me." Margaret laughed softly. "I have been telling my daughter that for months." Victoria remained standing near the hallway, watching the exchange unfold with growing disbelief. Nothing about Ethan's behavior felt rehearsed. He moved naturally through the house, placing fresh bread into the pantry, replacing empty soup cans with new ones, and quietly checking the expiration dates on medication bottles resting beside the coffee maker. He never asked permission because he already knew exactly where everything belonged. Margaret noticed Victoria's puzzled expression and smiled knowingly. He has been helping me almost every afternoon. Ethan shook his head gently. It is nothing special. Margaret looked at him with playful disappointment. You always say that, and you are always wrong. Victoria slowly walked toward the kitchen. How long has this been happening? Margaret answered before Ethan could. Almost 8 months. Victoria blinked. 8 months. That meant Ethan had started helping shortly after losing his position at the company. She looked at him again, searching for any sign that he had helped her mother because of who she was. She found none. Ethan simply unpacked groceries as though this afternoon were no different from any other. Margaret pointed toward a small notebook resting beside the refrigerator. Tell her about the list. Ethan smiled awkwardly. It is only a shopping list. Margaret laughed again. Show her. Victoria picked up the notebook. Each page contained neat handwriting with reminders about groceries, prescription refills, doctor appointments, lawn care, changing smoke detector batteries, replacing furnace filters before winter, and even birthdays for neighbors living on the same street. Every task had been checked off with careful attention. At the bottom of one page, Ethan had written a simple reminder. Ask Lily if she can visit Saturday because Margaret enjoys hearing her piano practice. Victoria slowly closed the notebook. You bring your daughter here? Ethan nodded. Margaret says the house feels less lonely when Lily plays. Margaret reached over and gently touched Victoria's hand. That little girl reminds me of your brother when he was young. Victoria lowered her eyes. Her younger brother had passed away years earlier, and hearing her mother speak about him with warmth instead of sadness felt strangely comforting. Ethan quietly filled the tea kettle with fresh water before placing it on the stove. He prepared tea without asking because he already knew exactly how Margaret preferred it. 1 teaspoon of honey. A thin slice of lemon. No sugar. Victoria watched every movement with silent amazement. This was not the behavior of someone hoping to impress another person. These were quiet routines built over countless ordinary afternoons. Margaret leaned back comfortably in her chair. He even fixed the loose porch railing after I almost slipped last spring. Then he repaired the mailbox, cleaned the gutters before autumn, and planted new flowers because he thought the front yard deserved another chance. Ethan looked slightly embarrassed. The flowers needed someone to water them. Margaret smiled. Just like people do. Victoria felt an unexpected weight settle inside her chest. Months earlier, she had judged Ethan almost entirely through performance reports, efficiency charts, and brief meetings inside polished conference rooms. Standing inside her mother's warm little home, surrounded by evidence of patient kindness that had never appeared on any resume, she began realizing there were entire chapters of a person's character that no business document could ever reveal. Outside, the rain slowly faded into a quiet evening drizzle, but inside that modest house, something much more important had already begun to change. That evening, after Ethan finished washing the teacups and making certain Margaret had taken her evening medication, he quietly gathered his empty grocery bags and prepared to leave. Margaret smiled warmly from her favorite chair. Do not forget that Lily promised to teach me another piano song this weekend. Ethan laughed softly. She has been practicing all week because she says you are her favorite audience. Margaret looked toward Victoria with gentle pride. That little girl fills this house with more joy than she will ever know. Ethan nodded. She says you remind her of the grandmother she barely remembers. Margaret's eyes glistened with gratitude before Ethan wished both women a peaceful evening and stepped outside into the cool Seattle air. Victoria stood silently by the front window, watching him cross the front yard and carefully stopped to straighten one of the flower pots that had shifted during the rain. He noticed a loose garden hose beside the porch, rolled it neatly onto its holder without hesitation, then continued toward his old pickup truck before quietly driving away. There had been no performance, no attempt to impress anyone, and certainly no mention of losing his job because of her decision. The next morning, Victoria woke earlier than usual. Instead of immediately opening her laptop to review company reports, she found herself staring through the kitchen window at the front yard her mother had always loved. The flowers looked healthier than they had in years. The grass had been trimmed evenly. Even the weathered wooden fence had recently been repaired in places she had never noticed before. Margaret entered the kitchen slowly with her walking cane and smiled when she noticed where her daughter was looking. He fixed that fence during the summer. Victoria turned around. He never mentioned any of this. Margaret poured herself a small cup of coffee before answering. People who help because they care usually do not make announcements. Victoria remained thoughtful. Why did he start helping you? Margaret smiled gently. That is actually a funny story. She settled into a chair beside the window. About 8 months ago, I dropped 2 grocery bags while trying to carry them inside. Before I could even bend down, Ethan pulled his truck over. He picked everything up, carried the groceries inside, noticed my smoke detector battery was chirping, replaced it before leaving, and came back 2 days later just to make certain I was doing all right. Victoria listened without interrupting. Margaret continued. I offered to pay him. He smiled and said his daughter would be disappointed if she discovered he charged neighbors for kindness. Victoria lowered her eyes. She could almost hear Ethan saying those words. They sounded completely natural coming from him. Did he ever tell you where he worked? She asked quietly. Margaret nodded. Only after several weeks. By then he had already lost his job. Victoria felt a knot tighten inside her chest. Did he ever say anything about me? Margaret looked genuinely surprised. Never. That single word echoed more loudly than any accusation ever could. Not once during months of helping her mother had Ethan spoken with bitterness about the woman responsible for one of the hardest moments of his life. Just then the doorbell rang. Margaret smiled immediately. That must be Lily. Victoria opened the front door and found a cheerful 10-year-old girl holding a small covered baking dish with both hands. Good morning, Lily said with an excited smile. My dad had to leave early for work this morning, so he asked if I could bring fresh blueberry muffins before school. Victoria accepted the warm dish, noticing a handwritten note taped neatly to the lid. It simply read, fresh this morning. Please make sure Margaret eats at least one while they are still warm. Have a wonderful day. There was no signature. There did not need to be. As Victoria watched the young girl wave happily before skipping back toward the sidewalk, she began realizing that the quiet character she had overlooked inside a conference room had never disappeared after losing his position. It had simply continued changing lives where nobody thought to look. Victoria had planned to stay with her mother for only a long weekend, but every passing hour quietly changed that decision. The conference calls she once treated as urgent became shorter. The endless stream of emails waiting on her laptop suddenly felt strangely distant compared to the peaceful rhythm inside the small house, where every ordinary moment carried a kind of value she had almost forgotten. On Monday morning, she stood beside the front window with a cup of coffee as the neighborhood slowly came to life. Children waited for school buses, neighbors walked their dogs, and delivery trucks rolled through the quiet streets. At exactly 7:30, Ethan's old pickup appeared at the end of the block. He was not carrying groceries this time. Instead, he stepped out holding a small toolbox. Victoria watched him cross the lawn and kneel beside the porch steps. One of the wooden boards had begun to loosen after the weekend rain. Without knocking on the door or expecting anyone to notice, he quietly tightened the screws, inspected the railing once more, and brushed away the sawdust with his hand before standing. He had almost reached his truck when an elderly man from across the street called his name. Morning, Ethan. Ethan smiled warmly. Good morning, Mr. Henderson. How is your shoulder feeling? The older man rotated his arm carefully before answering. Much better since you fixed that gate for me. Ethan nodded. That is good to hear. Before he could leave, another neighbor waved from her front yard. Thank you again for replacing my porch light yesterday. Ethan simply smiled and wished her a wonderful day. Victoria stood perfectly still. One conversation became another, and then another. A young mother thanked him for helping change a flat tire the previous week. A mail carrier smiled and asked about Lily's piano recital. Nobody spoke to Ethan with the formality reserved for an important businessman. They greeted him like someone they trusted completely. Margaret quietly joined her daughter by the window. Now you understand why everybody smiles when his truck comes down this street. Victoria never looked away from the scene outside. Does he help everyone? Margaret smiled. Not because he is trying to save the neighborhood. He simply notices what other people overlook. Just then, Ethan opened the back of his truck and removed a folded aluminum ladder. Without hesitation, he carried it to the house next door, where an American flag had become tangled around its pole after the storm. Within minutes, the flag hung freely again, gently moving in the morning breeze. He folded the ladder, returned it to the truck, and drove away before anyone could offer him money or praise. Victoria felt an uncomfortable question growing louder inside her mind. She had spent years believing leadership meant making difficult decisions quickly, measuring results carefully, and rewarding visible performance. Yet the quiet man she had dismissed from her company seemed to inspire more genuine respect on one ordinary street than many executives earned in entire careers. Later that afternoon, Victoria accompanied her mother to a routine doctor's appointment. As the receptionist checked them in, she looked toward Margaret with a cheerful smile. "How is your favorite handyman doing?" Margaret laughed. "Which one?" The receptionist grinned. "There is only one Ethan." Even the nurse recognized his name. Before Margaret entered the examination room, the family physician stopped to greet them. "Please tell Ethan I appreciated the detailed medication schedule he organized for you. It made today's visit much easier." Victoria blinked in surprise. "He made a medication schedule?" The doctor nodded. "Very thorough. Dates, dosages, refill reminders, emergency contacts. I wish every family prepared information that carefully." As they walked back to the parking lot, Victoria remained unusually quiet. She had once believed she understood exactly who Ethan Carter was because she had reviewed his employment file. Now she realized she had only read a few pages from a life that was much larger than anything an office record could ever contain. The following afternoon, Victoria found Ethan in the backyard replacing a weathered bird feeder that had finally given in to years of wind and rain. He measured each piece carefully, tightened every screw by hand, and stepped back only after making certain it was perfectly level. Margaret watched from the kitchen window with quiet satisfaction. "The birds will approve," she joked. Ethan smiled. "They are the real inspectors." Victoria walked outside carrying 2 mugs of fresh coffee. She hesitated for a moment before offering one to him. "I thought you might need a break." Ethan accepted it with a grateful nod. "Thank you." For several moments, neither of them spoke. The autumn breeze carried the scent of cedar trees through the yard, while a pair of sparrows landed on the nearby fence, as if already investigating their new home. Victoria finally broke the silence. "I have been trying to understand something." Ethan looked toward her calmly. "What is that?" She lowered her eyes briefly before speaking with unusual honesty. "Why did you never tell my mother who I was?" Ethan took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Because she is my neighbor, not my connection to my former employer." Victoria looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of his answer. "You never thought about stopping after you realized whose house this was?" Ethan smiled gently. "I realized it the first time I saw your family photograph on the piano." Victoria stared at him. "You knew from the beginning?" He nodded once. "Your graduation picture was beside your mother's wedding photograph." She felt almost speechless. "Then why did you keep coming?" Ethan looked across the yard where sunlight filtered softly through the maple trees. "Because Margaret still needed groceries on Tuesday. Her porch light still needed replacing on Thursday. Her leaves still needed raking on Saturday. None of those things changed because of something that happened at work." His voice remained calm, free from accusation or bitterness. Victoria felt the weight of those words settle deeply inside her heart. "I made a decision that changed your life." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he tightened one final screw on the bird feeder before placing the screwdriver back into his toolbox. "You made a business decision based on the information you believed was correct." Victoria shook her head slowly. "That does not make it right." Ethan looked at her with quiet kindness. "Perhaps not. But carrying resentment would not have helped me raise Lily. It would only have made both of us heavier." Those words lingered in the cool afternoon air. At that very moment, Lily came skipping through the backyard gate after school, still wearing her backpack and carrying a stack of music books. "Dad," she called happily before stopping beside Margaret's garden. She smiled politely at Victoria. "Hello, Miss Bennett." Victoria smiled back. "Hello, Lily." The young girl immediately noticed the new bird feeder. "You finished it." Ethan nodded. "Just in time before winter." Lily looked proudly toward Victoria. "My dad says birds remember safe places." Margaret laughed from the porch. "People do too." As everyone shared the quiet moment, Daniel Moore, the longtime family attorney and neighbor, walked over carrying a folder beneath his arm. "Margaret, I have the paperwork you asked for." He noticed Ethan and smiled warmly. "Perfect timing. I was hoping to see you." Daniel turned toward Victoria. You probably do not know this, but if Ethan had not stepped in after your mother's water heater failed last spring, she would have been staying in a hotel for nearly 2 weeks. He coordinated the repairs, met every contractor here, and never accepted a single dollar for his time. Victoria slowly looked from Daniel to Ethan, then toward her mother, who simply smiled with quiet affection. Every news story felt less like another act of kindness and more like another mirror reflecting the character she had completely failed to recognize. For the first time in many years, Victoria understood that success without humility could overlook the very people whose quiet integrity held entire communities together. The next morning, the neighborhood looked exactly as it always had, yet Victoria felt as though she were seeing it for the very first time. She postponed another executive meeting, silenced her phone, and joined Margaret on the front porch with 2 steaming mugs of cinnamon tea. Across the street, children laughed while waiting for the school bus. A neighbor waved from his driveway. Another stopped to ask Margaret how she was feeling. It was a community built on ordinary conversations, but beneath those conversations, Victoria now recognized something she had overlooked for years. Trust had been quietly built here, one small act at a time. Shortly before noon, Ethan's pickup rolled slowly onto the street. He parked at the curb instead of the driveway because a delivery truck was unloading furniture for another family next door. Before Ethan could even gather his toolbox, the young couple struggled with an oversized bookshelf that would not fit through their front door. Ethan walked over without hesitation. Try turning it about 45 degrees, he suggested with an easy smile. The couple adjusted the angle exactly as he described, and within seconds the bookshelf slid smoothly inside. Thank you, the husband said with relief. Ethan simply wished them well and continued toward Margaret's house as though nothing remarkable had happened. Victoria noticed something else. Nobody seemed surprised that he had stopped to help. They expected it because that was simply who he was. Ethan knocked gently before entering with Margaret's permission. He carried a small folder instead of groceries. I brought copies of your medical appointments for next month, he explained. I also scheduled the furnace inspection before the weather gets colder. Margaret smiled proudly. He keeps my calendar more organized than I ever did. Victoria accepted the folder and slowly turned each page. Every appointment, reminder, emergency phone number, pharmacy refill date, and transportation plan had been carefully written in clear handwriting. There were even notes reminding Lily to call Margaret every Wednesday evening after piano practice because, according to Ethan, conversations were just as important as medicine. Victoria looked up quietly. You really think about everything. Ethan shrugged modestly. Only the things that make life easier for someone else. Margaret excused herself for a short afternoon nap, leaving the two of them alone in the living room. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting gentle patterns across the hardwood floor. After a long silence, Victoria finally spoke. I owe you an apology. Ethan listened without interrupting. When I let you go, she continued softly, I believed I was protecting the company. I trusted reports more than conversations. I judged your value without taking the time to understand your character. Ethan remained quiet for several moments before answering. An apology matters because it is sincere, not because it changes the past. Victoria felt her eyes begin to glisten. Can you forgive me? Ethan looked toward the family photographs resting on the mantel. There was a picture of Margaret holding Lily's hand in the garden, both laughing at something outside the frame. He smiled gently before looking back at Victoria. I forgave you a long time ago. She looked genuinely surprised. Why? Ethan answered with the same calm dignity that had guided every choice he had made. Because Lily was watching how I responded. Children learn far more from what we carry than from what we say. I wanted her to grow up believing that grace is stronger than bitterness and that second chances begin inside our own hearts. Victoria lowered her head, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. During all her years leading one of the region's fastest-growing companies, she had attended leadership seminars, read best-selling books, and listened to celebrated speakers. Yet the most important lesson she had ever received came from a quiet single father sitting across from her, a man who had lost a job but refused to lose his dignity, proving that true character never announces itself loudly because it quietly changes every life fortunate enough to encounter it. Within a few weeks, quiet changes began spreading far beyond Margaret's little blue house. Neighbors who had once hurried from one obligation to the next now paused to check on one another. Someone mowed the lawn for an elderly veteran recovering from surgery. Another family organized weekly grocery deliveries for two widows living alone at the end of the street. Children began waving to older residents instead of walking past with their eyes fixed on their phones. No one held a meeting to create these changes. No one announced a campaign. Kindness simply traveled from one person to another, almost the way sunlight slowly reaches every corner of a room after the curtains are opened. Ethan never noticed that people were quietly following his example because he continued living exactly as he always had. Every Tuesday, he visited Margaret after finishing work. Every Wednesday, Lily played the piano in Margaret's living room while the elderly woman closed her eyes and smiled through every note. Every Saturday morning, Ethan checked smoke detector batteries, cleaned leaves from gutters, and carried heavy packages for anyone who needed help before returning home to cook dinner with his daughter. One crisp autumn afternoon, a local community newspaper reporter stopped near Margaret's front yard after hearing several neighbors tell remarkably similar stories about the same man. She politely introduced herself and asked Ethan whether she could interview him for an article about volunteer service. Ethan smiled apologetically. "I appreciate the offer, but I think there are many people doing much more important work than I am." The reporter looked surprised. "Everyone on this street keeps mentioning your name." Ethan gently shook his head. "Then perhaps they should be talking about each other instead. Good things usually happen because many people care, not because one person does." The reporter respected his wishes and quietly left without another question. Victoria had witnessed the entire conversation from Margaret's porch. She had spent years watching executives compete for recognition, awards, and headlines. Yet the one person everyone genuinely admired seemed determined to remain invisible. That evening, she returned to her downtown office for the first time since arriving in Seattle. The modern glass building looked exactly as she remembered, but something inside her had completely changed. During the executive leadership meeting, department heads presented quarterly numbers, growth projections, and hiring plans. Victoria listened carefully before closing the presentation on the large conference screen. The room became unusually quiet. "Before we discuss another chart," she said calmly, "I want to discuss character." Several executives exchanged confused glances. Victoria continued, "We have become very good at measuring productivity. We have become very good at measuring profit. I am no longer certain we have become equally good at recognizing integrity, humility, and quiet leadership." She paused before adding words that surprised even herself. "Months ago, I made a decision about an employee based almost entirely on reports and assumptions. I never truly learned who that person was." No one interrupted. "Beginning today, we are changing how we lead. Managers will spend time understanding the people behind the performance. We will reward those who strengthen others, not only those who produce impressive numbers. A successful company should improve lives inside the office as well as outside it." The meeting ended with thoughtful silence instead of applause. Later that evening, Victoria drove back to Margaret's neighborhood just as the sun disappeared behind the evergreen trees. She noticed children laughing in front yards, neighbors talking across fences, and porch lights slowly illuminating the peaceful street. Ethan and Lily were walking home together carrying an empty casserole dish Margaret had insisted they borrow. Lily reached for her father's hand as they crossed the sidewalk, and Ethan looked down at her with the quiet smile of a man who measured wealth differently than most people. Watching them disappear into the evening light, Victoria realized that the greatest leaders were often the ones who never imagined they were leading anyone at all, because their lives spoke more powerfully than their words ever could. Winter arrived gently in Seattle, wrapping the neighborhood in cool mornings and quiet evenings filled with the warm glow of porch lights. Margaret's little blue house remained just as welcoming as ever, but something inside it had changed. Victoria no longer felt like a visitor rushing between meetings and airport terminals. She had become part of the daily rhythm, helping prepare meals, organizing medications with her mother, and sometimes waiting by the window for the familiar sound of Ethan's old pickup truck turning onto the street. One Saturday afternoon, Margaret invited several neighbors for homemade soup and fresh bread. The living room filled with laughter, stories, and the comforting sound of Lily playing holiday songs on the piano. Mr. Henderson arrived carrying apple pie. The young couple from next door brought warm cornbread. Even the mail carrier stopped by after finishing his route. It was not a formal gathering. It was simply a neighborhood celebrating the people who quietly made it feel like home. As everyone settled around the dining table, Margaret slowly stood with the help of her cane and gently tapped her spoon against a glass. The room became still. She looked toward Ethan with eyes full of gratitude. "There is something I have wanted to say for a long time." Ethan immediately smiled. "Margaret, you do not have to." She raised one finger with playful determination. "Today I do." Soft laughter filled the room before silence returned. "Many people believe kindness begins when life becomes easy," Margaret continued. "But I learned the opposite. The man sitting over there came into my life when he was carrying burdens most people never saw. He had lost a career he worked hard to build. He was raising a beautiful little girl by himself. He was rebuilding his own future one day at a time. Yet somehow he always found enough strength to help someone else first." Nobody spoke. Even Lily quietly rested her hands on the piano keys. Margaret smiled through grateful tears. "He repaired my home. But more importantly, he reminded me that I was never forgotten. Every visit, every grocery bag, every conversation told me that I still mattered." Victoria felt her own eyes fill with emotion as Margaret slowly turned toward her. "My daughter came home believing she needed to take care of me. She did. But she also discovered someone who quietly took care of both of us long before she walked through that front door." Victoria stood slowly, unable to remain seated any longer. She faced the room before finally looking directly at Ethan. "There is something I should have said months ago, and something I should have done even earlier." She paused, gathering the courage that true humility often requires. "I judged a remarkable man through incomplete information. I confused quietness with a lack of leadership and kindness with ordinary behavior. I was wrong." The room remained peacefully silent. Victoria reached into her handbag and removed a neatly folded envelope. "Our company has created a new community leadership initiative. It is named the Carter Fellowship. Every year it will support employees who quietly strengthen families, neighborhoods, and communities through service, integrity, and compassion. The first recipient will not be chosen by executives. It will be chosen by the people whose lives have actually been changed." Ethan looked at the envelope but made no move to accept it. "Victoria," he said gently, "I never helped anyone expecting my name on anything." She smiled softly. "I know. That is exactly why it belongs there." Margaret reached across the table and placed Ethan's hand inside Victoria's. "Sometimes the greatest gift is not recognition," she whispered. "Sometimes it is knowing that one quiet life has inspired another to become better." Outside, snowflakes began drifting softly beneath the streetlights, while warm laughter returned to the little house. No applause filled the room. No speeches followed. Only peaceful conversation, grateful hearts, and the quiet understanding that genuine redemption never arrives with loud celebration. It simply opens the door, sits beside ordinary people, and gently changes the way they choose to live from that day forward. 1 year later, the neighborhood looked much the same, yet everyone who lived there quietly understood that something lasting had taken root. The maple trees once again stretched their branches over peaceful sidewalks. Children rode their bicycles after school, and the familiar blue house remained filled with warmth, music, and the comforting smell of fresh bread. Margaret still greeted every sunrise from her favorite chair beside the front window, although now she smiled even more often because she no longer felt alone. Victoria visited every weekend she could, not because she felt obligated, but because she had discovered that success meant very little if there was no one with whom to share it. Ethan's old pickup still rolled onto the street every Tuesday afternoon at nearly the same time. He still carried groceries, checked light bulbs, trimmed shrubs, and asked Margaret whether she needed anything before she had the chance to ask herself. Some habits were simply too beautiful to replace. Lily had grown taller over the past year, and her piano playing now filled the little living room with confidence and joy. Margaret often joked that the neighborhood clock no longer needed batteries because everyone could tell it was Wednesday evening whenever they heard music drifting through the open windows. At Victoria's company, the Carter Fellowship quietly became one of the most respected traditions the organization had ever created. Employees no longer competed only for promotions or bonuses. They began sharing stories about coworkers who mentored struggling colleagues, volunteered in their communities, cared for aging parents, or quietly supported families facing difficult seasons. During the annual company gathering, Victoria stood before hundreds of employees without a presentation behind her or complicated charts on the screen. She simply smiled and said, "The greatest lesson I have ever learned came from someone I once underestimated. Titles can introduce us, but character is what people remember long after the introductions are over." The room answered not with loud applause at first, but with thoughtful silence, the kind of silence that appears when people recognize an undeniable truth. Ethan attended only because Victoria personally invited both him and Lily, and he sat near the back of the room, hoping not to be noticed. When Victoria invited him to the stage, he shook his head with an embarrassed smile. She walked down from the stage instead, meeting him where he sat. "Leadership," she said softly so everyone could hear, "does not always stand under bright lights. Sometimes it quietly sits in the last row." The audience rose together in a standing ovation that lasted far longer than Ethan felt comfortable accepting. He never raised his hands in celebration. He simply thanked everyone with the same humble smile that had carried him through every ordinary day. After the ceremony, Ethan and Lily stopped by Margaret's house before returning home. Victoria was already there, helping her mother set the dinner table. For bowls of homemade soup rested beside a basket of warm rolls, just as they had so many times before. Nothing about the meal looked extraordinary, yet somehow it felt richer than any formal banquet. They laughed, shared memories, listened to Lily play one more song, and watched the evening sunlight fade into a sky painted with soft shades of gold and blue. As Ethan prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the front door. "You know," she said with a gentle smile, "people often believe miracles arrive with great noise." Ethan smiled back. "Maybe they simply arrive quietly enough for grateful hearts to notice." Margaret nodded. "Exactly." Ethan stepped onto the porch, where the flowers he had planted long ago were blooming once again. He looked back as Victoria held the door open for her mother, both women smiling with the peaceful confidence of people who had found something more valuable than success or comfort. They had found redemption, grace, and the quiet dignity that only kindness can leave behind. The door slowly closed, not as an ending, but as a gentle reminder that every ordinary act of goodness has the power to open another heart somewhere down the road, often long before anyone realizes that a simple decision to help another person can become the story that changes countless lives forever.